Picture a train moving through the middle of nowhere. It is night. The desert around it is flat and empty for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Inside one of the cars, a worker is sleeping in a real bed, under a real blanket, while the train keeps rolling at full speed. No one wakes him up. No one asks him to stop the train. This is not a dream. This is normal life for freight train crews in Australia. Now picture the same idea in the United States. A worker sleeping in a bed while a freight train rolls through the night. In America, this would break the law. Federal rules do not allow it. The train must stop. The crew must rest on the ground, not on the train. So here we have two big countries, both full of trains, both moving heavy freight across long distances, but they solved the very same problem in two totally different ways. One country built bedrooms into its trains, the other built a strict stopping system instead. Why did that happen? The answer is not simple, but it makes complete sense once you understand the land, the history, and the laws behind each country's railway system. Let's start with what an Australian crew car actually looks like, because it is more interesting than most people expect. From the outside, it looks like an old passenger train car, because in most cases, that is exactly what it used to be. Railway companies took old passenger carriages that were no longer needed and turned them into moving rest houses for train workers. Step inside one of these cars and you will not find plain seats. You will find small private bedrooms, each with a proper mattress and a reading light. There is a shared living area where workers can relax. There is a kitchen with a stove, a microwave, and a fridge. There is a bathroom with a working shower. There is even a small laundry room to wash clothes, and a generator to keep the electricity running. Since parts of the Australian desert can reach temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius in summer, these cars also have proper air conditioning. This is not a luxury hotel on wheels. It is simple, practical, and built for one clear purpose: to keep the next set of drivers well rested so they can safely take control of the train the moment their turn comes. To understand why Australia needed this kind of car in the first place, you need to understand just how empty its land really is. The railway line from Sydney to Perth stretches for more than 4,000 kilometers. To give you an idea, that is close to the same distance as traveling all the way across the United States, from New York to Los Angeles. But here is the real difference. In America, a freight train crossing that same kind of distance will pass through many big cities along the way, places like Chicago, Kansas City, and dozens of smaller towns. Each one of these places has hotels, staff, and proper facilities for changing train crews. In Australia, once a train leaves a town called Port Augusta and starts heading west, there is almost nothing for over 1,600 kilometers. This stretch of land is called the Nullarbor Plain, a flat and dry area with no trees, no towns, and almost no people. Part of this railway line even runs perfectly straight for 478 kilometers, the longest straight stretch of railway track anywhere in the world. There are no motels near the tracks. There is no place to safely stop and change a tired crew, because for most of that journey, there is simply nobody living there at all. In a place like this, stopping the train to change workers is not realistic, so the only real solution was to bring the rest area onto the train itself. But the story of Australian railways goes back even further than this, and it involves a strange mistake that shaped the entire country's rail system. In the 1850s, when railway building first began across Australia, the country was still divided into separate colonies, and each colony made its own decisions. Different colonies chose different track widths, known as gauges, without talking to each other. Some picked the British standard width, others picked a wider width. A few picked a narrower width to save money on tough terrain. The result was a railway system with 3 different gauges that simply could not connect properly. When 2 of these lines finally met at a town called Albury in the year 1883, passengers actually had to get off one train, walk across the platform, and board a completely different train, just because the track width had changed. Freight had to be manually unloaded from one wagon and reloaded onto another wagon with a different gauge. By the time the Second World War arrived, there were 14 separate places across the country where this kind of transfer had to happen. During the war alone, more than 1,800,000 tons of freight had to be moved by hand between mismatched trains, and over 1,600 workers were employed just to do this job. One former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, who loved trains, once said that the country had used 22 different track widths throughout its history. This was not just annoying, it shaped the entire economy of the country. For many years, it was actually easier and cheaper to send goods along the coast by ship than to deal with this railway mess. When Australia finally built a proper long-distance freight line using a single matching gauge, the towns along the way were still far apart, because the old system had never been designed for long journeys across the country. It had only ever been designed for short trips to nearby ports. This is part of the reason crew cars became necessary. The land between towns was already huge, and the railway had never been built with long-distance travel in mind. The railway line that changed everything was built between 1912 and 1917. It connected Port Augusta in the east to a town called Kalgoorlie in the west, cutting straight across the Nullarbor Plain. Building this railway was an extremely hard task. Summer temperatures often crossed 40 degrees Celsius. The nearest towns were often hundreds of kilometers behind the workers building the track. These workers lived in moving camp trains that shifted forward as the railway line grew, and every week, a special supply train would bring them food and other basic needs. This became known as the tea and sugar train. Even after construction finished, this train kept running for decades, delivering supplies to tiny railway maintenance towns that had grown up along the empty line. One town called Cook had, at its highest point, only about 40 people living there, and it existed purely to support the railway. These places were so cut off from normal life that the tea and sugar train even carried a butcher, a basic banking service, and a small post office along with it. It ran all the way from 1915 until 1996. Even today, freight trains cross this same empty stretch of land, and even though most of these tiny maintenance towns are now gone, the basic problem has never changed. You cannot easily change a train crew in the middle of the Nullarbor because there is still nothing there to help you do it. While Australia was solving its problem with sleeping cars, America was busy building its own famous piece of railway history, but for a completely different reason. This was the caboose, the small car that used to sit at the back of almost every American freight train. The caboose was never built for sleeping. It was built for watching. From the 1860s onward, the caboose carried workers like the conductor and the brakeman, whose job was to keep an eye on the entire train from a small raised lookout window on the roof. Before modern air brakes were invented, workers sometimes had to physically walk along the top of a moving train just to set the brakes by hand. The caboose gave them a base to work from. It did have a stove and basic sleeping space, because crews sometimes stayed on board for days at a time during long trips, but its real purpose was to help the crew watch the train, not to give them a proper rest. By the 1980s, new labor agreements shrank crew sizes, and new electronic devices could do the job of watching the train automatically. The caboose was no longer needed, and within a few years it almost completely disappeared from American railways. It was simply too expensive to keep running for something that machines could now do on their own. America also has a very strict law that shapes everything about how its train crews work. Under this law, no train worker can stay on duty for more than 12 hours in a row. When those 12 hours are finished, the train must stop completely, and the crew must wait for a new team to arrive and take over. There are almost no exceptions to this rule, except in true emergencies like natural disasters. After a safety law passed in 2008, the required rest period after a 12-hour shift grew from 8 hours to 10 hours, and during that rest time, the railway company is not even allowed to contact the worker. This creates a real challenge. Crews have to plan carefully so that when their 12 hours run out, the train is stopped in a safe place, away from crossings and busy areas. But sometimes things do not go as planned, and the train simply has to stop wherever it happens to be. Workers even have a special word for this. They call it the train going out law. It means the train is stuck, blocking the tracks, until a fresh crew can be brought out to take over. In busy areas, a single stuck train can cause delays across an entire region. In Australia, the same 12-hour rule exists too, but there is no need to stop the train, because the replacement crew is already resting inside the crew car just behind the engine. When one team's shift ends, the next team simply walks forward and takes control, and the train never has to stop at all. It helps to understand why this 12-hour rule exists at all, because it is not just paperwork. A tired person behind the controls of a heavy freight train is a serious danger, not only to the crew, but to anyone living near the tracks. Freight trains often carry things like fuel, chemicals, and other materials that can be extremely dangerous if something goes wrong. A single mistake made by an exhausted worker, something as simple as missing a signal or reacting too slowly, could lead to a derailment. In a busy area, that kind of accident could put homes, schools, and entire neighborhoods at risk. This is exactly why American lawmakers built such a strict wall around working hours. They decided it was safer to force a train to stop completely than to trust that a tired worker could keep making good decisions hour after hour. It is a cautious approach, built on the idea that safety should never depend on how strong or alert one person feels after 11 hours of work. Australia takes fatigue just as seriously, but it solves the same safety concern in a different way. Instead of forcing the whole train to stop, it simply makes sure a fresh, fully rested worker is always close by and ready to take over the moment the clock runs out. Both systems are trying to protect against the exact same danger. They just chose two very different paths to get there, shaped by the land each country had to work with. The American system of changing crews at fixed stations creates its own kind of stress for workers. After finishing a shift, a tired crew member is usually driven to a nearby hotel to rest for the required hours. But once that rest period ends, the company can call them back to work with as little as 2 hours' notice. This means a worker who finishes a shift at midnight and rests until late morning might suddenly be called back to duty at any moment after that rest ends, with almost no warning. This unpredictable schedule has caused a lot of tension between workers and railway companies over the years. There is also something called limbo time, which is the waiting period after a shift ends, before transportation arrives to take the worker home or to their next job. This time does not fully count as work, and it does not fully count as rest either, and workers have complained about it for a long time. Life for an American freight crew often feels unpredictable, never knowing exactly when the next call will come. In Australia, the system works very differently because the schedule is decided by a simple rotation on board the train, not by a sudden phone call at an unusual hour. The modern Australian crew car fleet exists largely because of two big changes that happened in the 1980s and 90s. During this time, passenger train services across rural Australia were shutting down, mostly because more people were traveling by road instead. At the same time, the country's freight rail system was being restructured to work more like a private business. This created an unexpected opportunity. As passenger trains stopped running, many old passenger carriages were left with nothing to do. Railway companies took these unused cars and rebuilt them into crew rest cars instead of scrapping them. This was a smart and low-cost solution, because converting an old carriage was far cheaper than building brand-new rest stations out in the middle of the desert, and far cheaper than flying tired workers in and out of remote areas by plane. So why can't America simply copy this idea and add sleeping cars to its own freight trains? The answer comes down to how differently the two countries are built. America has an enormous railway network, and much of it runs close to cities and towns that already have proper crew change stations. These stations are usually spaced only a few hundred kilometers apart, which is close enough for a crew to finish their shift and be relieved without any trouble. This system already works well for most of the country. Adding sleeping cars would also create new problems. Extra cars mean extra weight, which lowers fuel efficiency. Any car carrying resting workers would need to meet strict national safety standards for passenger-style vehicles, which are very different from freight car standards. Labor agreements between companies and worker unions are also built entirely around the current system of fixed crew change stations, with pay and schedules tied to specific locations. Changing this would mean rewriting labor contracts from scratch. But maybe the biggest reason of all is the law itself. Under American rules, any time spent on a moving train counts as being on duty, even if a worker is sleeping in a bed at that exact moment. This is not a mistake in the law. It is a deliberate choice, based on the idea that someone traveling on a train, especially one carrying dangerous goods through populated areas, should always be considered available for duty, no matter what they are doing at that moment. To change this, lawmakers would need to rewrite the rules completely, and the entire safety philosophy behind American railways would need to shift from stopping the train to rotating the crew while it keeps moving. There is one more twist to this story, and it points toward a future where the whole debate might not matter anymore. In a remote mining region of Western Australia, a mining company spent close to $1 billion building the world's first fully self-driving heavy freight railway. Since 2018, trains made up of several engines and hundreds of wagons have been hauling huge amounts of iron ore across hundreds of kilometers of empty desert, with no driver sitting inside the train at all. These trains are watched from a control center located over 1,000 kilometers away. As of recent years, more than 50 of these self-driving trains have been running at the same time across thousands of kilometers of private track. Workers still control the trains remotely from a distance, and human drivers are still used for the final part of the journey near the ports. But the long, lonely stretch through the desert, the very stretch that once needed crew cars and resting workers, no longer needs anyone on board at all. This new system has even removed the need to drive tired workers out to remote locations for shift changes, saving huge amounts of travel on rough desert roads every single year. American railways have shown interest in similar automated technology, but their situation is far more complicated. Unlike a private mining railway serving one company, the American rail network is a shared public system that runs directly through cities, towns, and thousands of road crossings. The safety rules, the laws, and the labor questions involved are much bigger and much harder to solve, so the two countries continue on very different paths. Australia, faced with a huge and empty land, built rolling bedrooms to keep its trains moving without stopping. America, with its dense network of cities and its long history of labor rules, built a system based on stopping the train completely and swapping the crew on the ground. Neither choice is wrong. Each one grew naturally out of a completely different landscape and a completely different history. The sleeping car rolling across the Australian desert tonight is not simply a better idea that America somehow missed. It is the result of old colonial mistakes, brutal desert conditions, and one simple fact. For over 1,000 kilometers in one direction, there is nothing around but flat, empty land. And now, with fully automatic trains already running successfully in parts of Australia, a new question is starting to form. In a future filled with self-driving trains and remote control centers, will anyone still need a bedroom behind the engine at all?